Hello everybody, welcome to a British audiophile. Apologies if this video is a little bit rough and ready. As regular viewers of this channel may have already noticed, I'm not at home. In fact, I'm in my parents' house. My parents moved into this house when I was 11, and it was about 4 or 5 years later that my father took me down to the local hi-fi store to buy a proper stereo system. It's fair to say that I was hooked from the beginning. That was around 1986, maybe 87. Yes, I am that old. And I still remember the components in that system to this very day. In fact, the speakers that we bought back then are still in this house today. The primary source was a CD player, the Marantz CD63, not the SE versions. The SE versions were tweaked by legendary designer Ken Ishiwata, who had a long-standing association with Marantz, but sadly just recently passed away. I also think the SE versions came a little bit later and were more expensive. Unfortunately, the CD63 packed up just after a few years of use and was replaced with the Nakamichi CD player, which was around the same price, around £350. The Nakamichi had a warmer, richer sound than the Marantz, perhaps wasn't quite as detailed. Taking care of analog tape duties, remember them, was sadly not a Nakamichi cassette deck. They were highly coveted and also rather expensive. I think the Nakamichi Dragon was around £1,500. For around £200 we purchased an Iowa cassette deck that I always thought was really good for the money, and I think it looked a little bit like this, although I can't remember the exact model. The last source component was an FM/AM tuner, the Denon TU260L. For an accessible component at around £120–130, it was hard to beat, and it won a number of awards. There were two mainstream amplifiers that were all the rage in the mid-80s and late 80s. For around £250 you either went and bought the Pioneer A400 or the Marantz PM40 SE. We elected for the PM40 SE. It was a great sounding amplifier, but it didn't last in the system that long. I can't remember if it was my father or me who got the upgrade itch, but within a few years it was replaced for the PM52 SE that had a lot more power and had a copper chassis. And it was a little bit tonally cooler than the PM40 SE, but was a much better match sonically with the Nakamichi CD player. The only components that are still in my parents' home from the original system that we purchased way back then, over 30 years ago, are the speakers, the Tannoy DC2000s, that retailed for around £350. The DC2000s were a real hot product at the time. I looked at the specs and they're fairly easy to drive with a 92 dB sensitivity and a nominal impedance of 6 ohms. They also dig down fairly deep for a sealed box design, with bass frequencies reaching down to the mid-40s. Bass is augmented by a second driver, also 8 inches or 200mm across, and made from the same polyolefin material. The real standout feature is the dual concentric driver that Tannoy are known for. Centrally mounted is the tweeter, and around it is an 8-inch or 200mm mid-woofer made from a variation of plastic known as polyolefin. So how does it sound? Well, I'm not going to suggest that it sounds better than the latest and greatest compact floor standing speakers at around £500 or £600. I suspect that they're going to be faster and more detailed, even though I haven't done direct A/B comparisons. That's just the impression that I have. Although I think it puts up a reasonable job, so I think if you can get a good used example for inside £200 and be aware of all the pitfalls that come with buying second-hand speakers, then it's worth considering. There's certain things it does really well. It's really easy to drive, so it's very forgiving of partnering equipment. It's also very forgiving of your room acoustics and the location in which you place the speakers within the room itself. And that's because it's got excellent off-axis performance due to those dual concentric drivers. Bass is strong, it's punchy, it's not the last word in bass speed. The mid-range is open, if not the last word in clarity. And the high frequencies are a little rolled off. Now that could be the speaker itself, or it could be the fact that it has an electrolytic cap in the crossover that's over 30 years old and needs replacing. I don't recall when I was listening to it many years ago as it being so rolled off in the high frequencies. Overall, it's going to appeal to people who want a fairly balanced sound, perhaps slightly on the soft side of neutral, and more of that vintage speaker sound. So that's it from me. I hope you've liked this anecdote about me reflecting back on where my audiophile journey started, and also this very subjective and informal review of the classic Tannoy DC2000 speakers. Until next time, British audiophile, signing off.